Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's DBA webinar on 2020 Dairy Farm Financial Performance, where we're going to be looking at benchmarking results from the wild year that we had last year with COVID and markets all over the place. We're excited to bring you this webinar today, sponsored by Compeer Financial. Compeer is such a great partner of the Dairy Business Association and has so much expertise in-house. So today we're privileged to be joined by Tim Swenson, a senior dairy consultant with Compeer, and Steve Schwoerer, senior dairy lending specialist with Compeer Financial. As we jump into today's webinar, I just wanted to give you a couple reminders. Phone lines actually will be muted, so you won't be able to have any distractions or worry about muting your lines. So please use the chat feature to submit questions or the question box. Feel free to submit them throughout the webinar, and then we will field those questions at the end of today's presentation. And then we are planning on recording today's webinar as well, and this will be made available following the event today. So with that, again, we want to thank and welcome Tim and Steve.
Thanks, Nicole.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. Just to give a little background information on Tim and myself, again, my name is Steve Schwoerer, Senior Lending Dairy Specialist at Compeer Financial. I work mainly out of the Fond du Lac office. I've been doing this about 34 and a half years now, so I've seen all kinds of operations, seen a lot of things happen over the 34 years, but I work in a territory that includes 8 counties surrounding Fond du Lac.
And I have been with Compeer's Dairy Consulting Group now for just shy of 16 years. I focus most of my effort with family dairies across Minnesota, Wisconsin. I do get into Northeast Iowa and to Northern Illinois with a few of the operations I work with. There are also 2 other individuals that work in our consulting group, Steve Bodart and Matt Lang, and they have a little more of a national scope to them. So our consulting group is currently working in 19 different states with herds ranging all the way from 400 cows to almost 20,000 cows. So we've got a wide perspective on the folks that we're working with. But I will say, as we kind of talk through the data set here this morning, it is somewhat of an upper echelon group. It's the data is being driven from herds that our consulting group is working with. And so it isn't just the average of our Compeer portfolio. It's averages and values that are associated with the group that are working in our Dairy Profit Manager program. So to kind of kick things off, as the title stated, you know, it was an unprecedented year. We started 2020 with a great deal of optimism in the dairy industry. Then we got to April and May, and things kind of came to a screeching halt with COVID closing everything down. We had producers that we were working with dumping milk, having to cut production in various ways, and then moved into June and July and saw record milk prices.
Yeah, what you notice too from the database, you know, the herds range from all different models. You know, so you're going to see there'll be some herds in the benchmarking model that raise all their crops, raise all their animals, produce all their crops, so even sell some grain, all the way down to the extreme of, you know, people are custom raising heifers, farming them out, and have very limited land acreage base. So sometimes you do some benchmarking. If you're trying to compare your numbers to some of the benchmarks, keep in mind there might be some areas where you're going to be a little lower end, and that's all right, that's fine, because you're comparing against different things. There also might be other areas where you're going to be high and on the upper end. So we take some of those things with a grain of salt, but also understand that there's a wide range of different models here. Some dairy producers have a model of lower production with lower costs, and also some dairy producers have a model of higher production and some higher costs. Neither is right or wrong, it's just a different model, so what works best for you. So we're trying to compare against all that. And all this, a lot of stuff is benchmarking. We're not trying to, we're trying to find out where some of our strengths and weaknesses are of the operation, and maybe turn that weakness into a strength. And a lot of times it's not about trying to make major change in operation, but a lot of little things. You know, where can we gain another 25 to 50 cents of margin? So these these areas we look at for benchmarking a lot of times bring on critical conversations that you'd have with your lender, your financial consultant, or even your tax advisor, or anybody else at any of your dairy team. So these critical conversations where sometimes a lot of these management decisions and changes can be made to make the operation more efficient.
So to start things off, we're going to take the first few slides here and just kind of set the table for everybody so that we kind of have a similar set of terms that we're utilizing, a similar set of guidelines, so that everybody kind of starts off on the discussion in the right place. We're going to be using a number of slides that have a graph that's similar to what you see on the screen right now. And as you look at that graph, you know, the diamonds are what's the average of the group in our data set, and you can see the small blue diamond. Last year we had an average net income of just a little over $400 a cow, but you can see that the large blue diamond right in the center of the page was what was the top 25% out of this. So the upper tier of the folks, and last year we were looking at about $1,100 for that group per cow net income. You know, I think the thing that we want to talk about is, as I mentioned, this is a data set that's working with the herds we're working with. We've got a little over 100,000 cows in the data set, just a little shy of 70 herds. The data we're going to be presenting this morning is just the Midwest section of that data. So it's going to focus on that Minnesota, Wisconsin type producer. And so you can see as we look at the increases in that top 25% for this last year, you know, we had a herd that was all the way up to $2,100 a cow, but there is a little bit of noise in this profit level because all these profit levels do include all of the government payments, CFAP 1, CFAP 2, as well as the PPP forgiveness for a number of operations here. So we do kind of have a wide and woolly range. But as we look at what constitutes that top 25% for 2020, we did make an attempt to factor out those government payments, and so our top 25% group that we identified is the top group, subtracting those government payments out.
And the reason we subtract those government payments out because we saw such a wide range of payments on that, and a lot of it depended on your business structure. You know, we saw single member LLCs were capped at a certain amount. We saw other LLCs on a dairy the same size that got much more money based on their ownership structure. The other thing I want to stress upon too when we go forward with these numbers is keep in mind that these numbers are all accrual numbers. If you try to make everything on an accrual basis, that really shows how the operation did financially perform in 2020. So if you're trying to compare your numbers to these benchmarks and use your tax return, you don't want to use a tax return. You want to use some different numbers. You want to use accrual numbers. So that's why it's important to also get a good year-end financial statement. Get a good 2019, a good 2020 year-end financial statement so you can make those accrual numbers. There was a lot of noise in that balance sheet this year. We saw a lot of prepaids to try to take care of some tax consequences. We also saw a lot of inventory that was held on to until the year after. We saw some income get deferred into 2021. Some dairy processors were able to hold off that last milk check or two and to be paid in 2021. So a lot of noise in that balance sheet. So nothing really matters unless you have a good year-end balance sheet to go along with that income statement to make those accrual adjustments. Then you can truly find out how 2020 was. And along with that, we're going to be looking at numbers that show a date and time for 2020. The more important thing about looking at your numbers and then comparing to benchmarking is looking at a trend. You know, how your numbers are going to tell you one thing for 2020, but how do they compare to 2019, 2018? Are you trending in the right direction or are you trending in the wrong direction? So look at trends as well as what the 2020 results were too.
That leads perfectly into the next set of slides here, Steve. You know, as we talk about, we'll be talking a little about our first margin level of income over feed cost. When we're talking about income over feed costs, we're talking about all of the forages consumed by the cows, whether they're home raised or whether they're purchased off the farm, all of the grains consumed. So whether you're purchasing your own growing your own corn or purchasing corn, and then all of our purchase supplements, so that we're trying to look at an income over feed cost that is consistent across all the herds by including the home raised feedstuffs as well as our purchase supplements. The other thing is, as Steve mentioned, the huge difference, we will be focusing all of our attention on accrual numbers, but I think we just want to take a moment and kind of lay out the differences between cash flow break even that everybody talks about and those accrual numbers. So as you look at cash flow break even, it's really just managing your checkbook. It's deposits, it's expenses that you're writing a check for, seed, fertilizer, chemicals, purchase feed, but it doesn't include those homegrown feeds. It looks at your labor costs that you're paying wages for, but doesn't necessarily include a living cost for yourselves as owners. It takes into account principal and interest payments, and then any cash expenditures that you might have made for various capital items. The contrary to that is looking at a cost of production, and we do a couple of things here when we look at cost of production. It's not only a raw cost of production, but we do energy correct that milk. So we're correcting the 100 weights of milk for protein content and fat content, so that as we look across different operations, we aren't skewing the data based on whether it's a 4% fat or 3.5%. So we're correcting for and standardizing to a set energy corrected value. As you look at that cost of production value, as Steve mentioned, accrual cost of production is what's going to affect your balance sheet. It's at the end of it is how do we get to that equity number you have. So when you look at the feed cost in our cost of production, as I mentioned, similar in the income over feed cost, it's all of our feeds, whether it be homegrown forages, purchased grain, homegrown grains, or purchased commodities. As you look at labor cost, again, in cost of production, accrual cost of production, we both got our wage labor as well as an allotment for you as the owners. An item that may be a little bit different, we can talk a little bit more about it a little later as we get farther into it, is a value for replacement costs. And what this really is the value of cows leaving our herd. We also take into account capital costs, our other production costs or cow costs, and then any of our overhead costs that are associated with growing our crop, fuel, insurance, any of those costs that might not be connected with an individual cow type situation. So as you start comparing and contrasting the two, the cost production and cash flow, cash flow utilizes principal payments, cost of production utilizes depreciation. As Steve mentioned, the accrual cost of production takes into account those changes in accounts receivable and whether you push some income into the following year or not. It takes into account changes in your accounts payable and how current you are. It accounts for those prepaid expenses that you may have had at the end of the year to help manage your tax liabilities.
And the reason we use the depreciation and cost of production versus principal, because everybody's debt structure is totally different. I mean, for depreciation, again, don't look at your tax return and see what line item your taxman has for depreciation. That's more of a tax depreciation. We're looking at more of a true management depreciation, where we're taking roughly 5% of the building cost or building value and 15% of the machinery value and calling that a true management depreciation. Again, you want to try to have principal payments on your debt be at or above that management depreciation, because you need to account for that. We need to replace equipment and try to stay ahead of the game as far as true depreciation. But that's going to change that cost structure quite a bit, whether you have your loans on a 10-year schedule, a 15 or a 20-year schedule, or have borrowing based loan where it's maybe some interest only payments. So looking at that principal payment that you're required to pay to a lender may be totally different than what the actual depreciation is. It's neither right or wrong, it's just a different way of looking at it, but you need to understand what those numbers mean, and they will definitely have a different cost structure to your break even.
Well, one other last item to make sure that we consider as you're looking at individual line items in a set of benchmark data is making sure that you're comparing your business structure. As Steve mentioned, there's a wide variety of business systems that are within this data set. And so where your feed expense might be a little bit higher than somebody else, Maybe it's because you're raising all of your heifers. Maybe you even have a steer enterprise that's increasing. So you might have to look at as this data set shows, look at both feed expense and as a portion of that custom raising expense. Or if you're having all of your crops custom harvested, your depreciation expense might be a little lower than others. So you have to make sure that as you're looking and trying to compare across the different line items that you take into account the value of your current system. So I guess enough of the baseline stuff. Let's kind of get into the meat of the discussion.
And of course, when we look at all these cost structures, we're looking at cost per hundredweight. And again, the most important thing is looking at energy corrected cost hundredweight. We can lower our cost by one of two ways. We can either produce more pounds, or we can produce the same amount of pounds but have better components. So we're trying to look at where we're looking at cost per hundredweight on a correct energy corrected basis. And just as yourself, look at 2018 and 19 and 20, especially at feed costs. That first item there, how that has increased, and we've seen feed costs go quite high. On the right-hand side, you see the 2019 and 20; those are the top 25%. So even though feed costs have gone up, the top 25% have found a way to curb that cost just a little bit. Their costs are higher, but not as high as the average. And now keep in mind, average is just that. It takes some of the extremes and try to put an average in that. But we're trying to get it, and when we look at benchmarking, we're trying to take your operation, and there's a lot of really good operations involved in this database, but trying to get your operation from better to best. So some of these items, like I said, you're going to be a little higher, and don't get too worried about that, because you might be in this another category where we're going to have certain categories that are higher to offset that as well too. But yeah, the feed costs definitely have gone up. We've seen commodity prices, and they'll probably continue going up into 2021. So as far as what we can take away from that, understand that situation is going to be happening, and we need to make sure we've got our other items in line as well.
I think, as we mentioned earlier, as we looked at that, the impact of those government payments, on a raw basis, looking at whole farm business cost of production at 1466. But if we add back in those government payments in the group, the government payments accounted for $2.72 for every hundredweight produced last year. And so as you start looking at an initial cost of production, everybody kind of got a little bit excited as you start looking at, well, what do we need to be looking at going into 2021 and putting our risk management program based on what our cost of production is, knowing that we probably weren't going to get those payments again this year. It changed the scope quite substantially.
But we also need to understand that we don't want to just eliminate government payments from last year's income statement and knowing that we won't get them this year, because some of that government payment did cover some costs or some losses that were incurred. We had milk prices in the 18-19 range going into March. All of a sudden, because of the pandemic, we had prices go down $11 and $12. So there were some actual losses that the pandemic cost us, and some of the government payments did cover up some of those losses. So it's also not right to just say we need to eliminate those total government payments from our budget next year because we had them last year. But we do need to understand that they won't be coming and budget accordingly, but we also won't have those couple months of some tougher losses. Negative PPD was a huge factor last year that still is around, but maybe won't be the same extent as last year. But just understand that some of those government payments did actually take care of some losses that were incurred, whether you were dumping milk, had to cut back production 20 or 10% for a certain time. So we do need to recognize that, but also understand that they won't be there to that extent this year again.
So as we start to look at the individual pieces of that cost of production, we'll start off with feed costs. Feed costs, when you include all of those forages and grains, is by far our number one largest cost that's associated with operating our dairy operation. As you look at the scope of what we're looking at here, you can see a range from a little over $7 a hundredweight for feed, all the way up to $11.40. Again, this is the scope of the businesses. We've got in the left-hand side of this graph, the left-hand whisker, we'll call it. Those are herds that are essentially just feeding milk cows, dry cows, is a milking operation. As we get to the right-hand whisker, now we start to have some herds that maybe don't quite have the same production levels, or are feeding all of their heifers, possibly even feeding some steers in here, or in one case actually feeding some hogs, and still driving some of those values up. But I think the big take-home message here, as you look at this feed cost, is looking at, you know, the average of this whole group for the year, holding in just a little under that $9.50. We'll go into a little more detail here, but you can see that overall, looking at the triangles, feed cost on average increased just a little more than 50 cents a cow. And you look at the top 25%, which is the circles, also saw that same increase. So there wasn't any magic in their system. They did have some increases, but didn't necessarily have quite the number, the full increase that some of the other operations had. As we kind of break that down a little bit further and really look at our income over feed costs and really look at breaking things down on a per cow basis, we can see that in you know, on a per head basis, very, very similar values between the average herds and that top 25%. So again, has been said many times before, we can't just steal that milk for nothing. It does cost some additional feed costs. But as you look, and why we start talking about income over feed costs, as you look at the value for a very, very similar feed cost per cow, we're getting an additional 60 cents a cow in value and income over feed, additional 60 cents of milk value for that feed cost. You know, how they're getting it is a little bit more efficient animal, you know, getting more for that. And so as we look at our costs, you can see the very, very similar forage to grain ratios in both, very similar cost per pound of dry matter, just a little over 11 cents a pound of dry matter. As we look at rations right now, we'd be ecstatic to be looking at 11 cents a pound of dry matter.
And what's interesting, Tim, you know, industry-wide, I think we can make a general statement that a lot of producers are getting production. You know, production is there. It's just the difference is it's costing some a little more to get that production than others, and that's kind of where the rubber hits the road. That's, you know, that income or feed cost is a very important ratio to look at. It's basically what's left after, you know, feed cost being a you know, probably one of your biggest feed costs, and probably the biggest feed cost in a line item. But it lets you, tells you how much is available after feed costs are taken care of. But it's amazing that, you know, they said the difference in feed costs can range from, you know, almost a dollar or so for sometimes even the same amount of production. That labor cost, and of course, this is you look at the wide range of labor costs when you break it down for 100 wage, all the way from a little over $2 up to $4.75. And again, some of that noise is part of how your operation is modeled, whether you have a lot of employees and doing a lot of cropping and versus a fewer employees and just maybe have a dairy and that buys a lot of feed. But it is interesting to see that, you know, labor costs have gone up, and but it's interesting is that the top 25% compared to the 2020 average are slightly lower, but not a whole lot lower. You know, I talked to a number of dairy producers that they look at labor costs, and yeah, they want to keep it minimal, but they also understand that there's certain regions of the state, certain regions of the country that labor costs are just going to cost a little more, a little less, depending on location. But a lot of times they talk to a customer and they say they also don't want to be the lowest labor cost producer either, because they might pay a little more labor. They feel like they have a better labor force, and that labor force is able to pick up on things a little quicker, less training, less turnover, less cost that way. But they also feel a better labor force that's paid well. They also can cut other costs. So maybe that labor force is able to do some vet work, some herd health work, so they can eliminate some other costs if they have a really strong labor force. And people aren't afraid to pay good wages for good labor. So you want to look at this number. Yeah, you don't want to overpay for labor, but it is interesting to see that there isn't a huge difference between the top 25% and the average, but there is quite a bit of range, and that range more or less has to do with what operation you run. But labor is a real sensitive situation right now. It's hard to find labor. In some instances, you got to pay more than you really want. But having a good labor force that is kept around and very reliable is important as well.
And I would say as a general rule, we probably took the biggest brunt of this early last year. It seemed as we moved into the latter part of the year and this first part of 2021, we haven't seen any reduction in wages by any stretch of the imagination. But as we're talking with producers going through first quarter results, we're really not hearing that they're having to bump as hard as they did at the same time last year in order to maintain labor forces. And as you hear in the news, all the places that can't find people to work, really haven't had, knock on wood, really haven't had a lot of producers saying that they're extremely short on the labor force in this first quarter. So
it is hard to find, there's no doubt about it, but they are finding a way to make it work. I guess if you talk to any business downtown, there'll be the same situation. Labor is hard to find, whether you're talking to local retailers, restaurants, or other businesses. It's the same manufacturing, the same situation. Labor is just hard to find. You got to sort through a lot of people to find it, but they are able to get the job done.
The other thing that, again, just to reinforce the discussion that we're having, as you look at this labor value, it does include all of our wage labor. It includes all of our payroll taxes, any insurance programs or workers' comp values that are associated with that labor force, but it also includes all of those owner draws in there. And so in situations like you mentioned earlier, where we may have a big family working here, all of those values are still included in this labor number, so that we are kind of able to compare across the different groups that we have to work with. So.
And of course, keep in mind, all these costs are based on per hundredweight. So I mean, how can we affect these costs? I mean, we certainly can affect these costs by running some more hundredweights in there, some more energy corrected hundredweights. That also helps. But of course, the key is, how do you run more hundredweights without affecting your other costs as well? Sometimes you want to, you're limited by what you can do based on what the milk plant has placed limits on you. Some situations you're able to add more cows as long as you don't change the footprint of the operation. Some operations, they're looking at your pounds of milk on a daily basis and wondering why it's going up. So they ask questions there. So it's a wide range. And so the hundredweights to increase sounds like it should be a simple situation or simple answer, but it's not quite that simple. It's more complex in today's industry.
As we move to the next part of our cost of production value, we look at this net herd replacement cost. And what we're trying to get at here in the system that we work with in the dairy operations that we have what we call a herd replacement cost. And what that cost is we take the value of an animal on your balance sheet, whether that's $1,500 or $1,700, whatever that value of a mature cow is on your balance sheet. And for every cow that leaves the herd, whether she's on the cull truck or whether she happens to go on the rendering truck, we assess that value in the expense line item. Now we offset that value by the cull value that we get for those cows. So as we look at this number here, and again, we do have some fairly substantial ranges here, but as you look at ways that we can affect this number, as you look at it, that top group has a 25 cent, 100 weight advantage on this, and where that top group is gaining that advantage is in a couple of different areas. One is in just the number of cows that they're trying to replace. They have their heifer inventories in balance with their replacement rate, so they don't have heifers pushing cows out the door. They have, if they do have some extra animals that are coming in from a heifer standpoint, they're getting some additional value by selling those animals as fresh 2-year-olds. That's also another way to affect your total hundredweights is keeping that heifers to cows in balance and getting the most milk that you can for the cows that you have in the barn. A little side note there. But as you look at these bottom ranges, there's a number of herds that are selling an extensive number of fresh animals out the door and getting some extremely good value for them. The other thing is you look at that top 25%, about a 2.5% difference in death loss in that group versus the other group. Not to say that the average is terrible for the group, it's just a little shy of 6%. And as you look at things on a national basis, that's still 3 to 4% better than a national basis. But as you look at that top 25%, they're culling an additional group of cows because they're just right at that 4% death rate. So again, they're getting value for the cows. So they may have the same number of cows leaving the herd on a total basis, but they're shifting cows that they're getting some money for or not getting some money for.
For the next few slides, we're going to talk about some income metrics here. And of course, yeah, as a dairy producer, we've been hammering, or everybody's been hammering on as far as cutting costs, got to cut costs. Well, it's to the point now where there's not a whole lot more cost to be cut. I mean, if you can cut costs, that'd be great. If a producer came to me and said, well, I cut my cost 50 cents or $1 weight, I'd be happy for them, number one. Also, be disappointed that they hadn't been doing that all the while. But I think we need to now more focus on income. You know, where can we get an extra 10 to 15, 25 cents hundredweight for income? Whether it be, you know, we're going to cull cows, let's make sure we cull cows that are in good shape and not get 900 for those cull cows instead of 400. Or do we have animals that we can sell for dairy purposes versus culling, stuff like that? If we're going to be selling bull calves, let's make sure we get the most for those and make sure we're selling some beef calves that are maybe at $150 a head versus Holstein bull calves at $50. So I think we really need to concentrate more in the future on where can we maximize some more income potential, whether it be components or just other sources of income. Try to get as much as we can out of those animals.
You know, flipping to this next slide here and dovetailing on what you're saying there, Steve. I mean, you look at the range of over $900 a cow in the value that some of these herds are getting. We had herds that were averaging over $1,000 a cow for the animals leaving their herd. Granted, as we mentioned, a high percentage of those were going for dairy sales, but even their true cull cows were still averaging above the group because they were making that culling decision at the right time in order to maximize the value of that cull cow. They were making that decision at dry off when she was fat and sassy, when buyers could get some value out of those cows and they were willing to pay for it.
Exactly. Here we look at the capital cost per hundredweight. It's interesting to see that range again, you know, from 75 cents roughly to 4.75. These are some things that we can control a little bit. You look at the average in that 250 range, and we understand that capital needs to be replaced. I mean, stuff wears out. Stuff is cost enough that we need to run it in 24/7. A lot of times we're going to have some capital costs. I think that the main thing is how do we kind of plan for some of these capital costs? The most important thing to take away from this is let's put together a 5-year plan of what we want to replace capital in the future. Again, a plan is just a plan, doesn't mean it has to be stuck to, but at least we know kind of what piece of equipment we're going to replace in the future. You know, where can we get this capital cost to be more evenly distributed over the year? I understand a major chopper replacement in 1 year is going to throw that number out of whack a little bit, but we can plan for that. Let's just try to make that capital cost a little less per hundredweight than just maybe going from variability of 1 year it's $1, next year it's $3, and kind of the ups and downs. That capital costs have a major impact on the bottom line. We take the income expenses, what we have left over is basically to pay principal and interest, and then also some of the capital costs to replace equipment. So it is interesting to see that, again, there isn't a huge range, but the top 25% do have a little less capital costs than others. Maybe it's buying used versus new. So those things do matter. We have a little control over this cost. Some of the costs we don't have a whole lot of control over, but we have some control over this. Getting back to that 5-year plan kind of helps us plan for those capital costs over time versus buying stuff on a whim and as we think we need to replace them.
And the other thing with this capital cost, as you look at it is a combination of that management depreciation that Steve talked about earlier, our interest cost, and then our lease cost. So in this, it doesn't, you know, if somebody is attaining new capital via a lease, it's taking into that account where we wouldn't have the depreciation and interest on that. So having the three of them together, it tries to match things up. But some of the other things, you know, obviously lower is better, but it's not necessarily as we get to the middle or or on either side of this box, is it terrible? I mean, we may have gone through a major expansion, so we've got some sizable depreciation value that's hit the operation. We may have our highest debt level at that point in time, so we've got some additional interest expense. So we need to understand where your business is at in its overall life cycle as to how we assess it. And I think it goes back to what you said earlier, Steve, on understanding your trend. It's one thing for us to talk about averages here and where you fit in with the averages, but it is so critical to understand where you are in that trend. If you're on the upper end of this range and your facilities are showing some age, your equipment is showing some age, and yet you still got a fairly high capital cost, it probably said the one thing. If everything's new, you just went through that major expansion, and then the same number may not be as critical for other operations.
Yeah, especially looking at these costs, we see some actually very successful operations that are running with what we consider lower production than others, but they've been able to do it with lower cost. I think the trend I've been seeing, Tim, last couple of years is some of those lower producing operations are trending now to see that those costs trying to creep up a little bit, where maybe they're not such low cost anymore. So we got to be careful that model we're running to make sure we know where our individual costs are trending in compared to income, to make sure we can nip some things in the bud and head off some potential problems before they get there. The other production costs here, basically, it's other production costs that are associated with the dairy herd, whether it be supplies, hoof trimming, some vet work. Again, see quite a range there from $1 to $3.20, $3.10, $3.15. Again, a lot depends on, some operations do their own vet work, do their own hoof trimming. So some of those costs are incorporated into labor. So that's where we get to the talking point of maybe we're a little high in labor, but maybe we're lower in some other production costs because our labor is doing more things for us than other categories. I believe some vet work is in this here too. So again, just knowing where your operation sits in that model, so some of the things you have to take and look at together. Look at labor in comparison to other production costs to see where you sit in the spectrum. Again, we can't be high in all the spectrum because now we're not getting the good mix of bang for the buck anyways.
So kind of taking and put a little bit of a bow on this cost of production number. As you look at it, you can see as we look at feed costs, that top group having just a little advantage there. A little, as we talked, a little bit of an advantage in overall labor costs. We talked about net herd replacement costs and the opportunity that it presented there. But I think the other thing to really look at that it kind of jumps out at me as I kind of look at this cost of production is you see a trend as you look in the averages. Feed costs kind of bouncing up, labor costs continuing to climb. But as you look at that top 25%, the movement in any one of those categories, it may have the same direction to it, but that direction is not quite as steep, not quite as much as it is in some of those. And so that's where, as you look at the performance of that upper group, that I always use the term steady hand, it really shows into that group.
That leads to the next slide of the whole farm cost of production. It's just amazing where this is where really some of those big differences where people start to separate from other operations is in cost of production. Again, the analysis of accrual, it takes into consideration whether you're purchasing feed or raising or growing your feed, and just look where that difference is in that top 25% to the average, and look at where the range is. The range is anywhere from $12.50 to $17.50. So again, this doesn't necessarily mean we have to be way on the left side of the spectrum. We also want to make sure we know where our income is in compared to the cost and create that margin. So basically, all these models are trying to create margin. Where that margin is, we're trying to find that sweet spot between milk production, feed costs, labor costs in relation to all other aspects of the operation. Where's that sweet spot for us? For some, it's in that 92 to 95 pound range. For some, others, it's in the 82 to 85 pound range. But I think over time, Tim, we've seen all kinds of operations. We've seen very successful operations at 82 pounds. We've seen very successful operations at 92 pounds. Neither one means that it's guaranteed success, but it's basically a model that you wrap around it that really makes the operation as a whole.
And jumping into that cost of that milk production per cow, I mean that as you look at profitability, cost of production is not the only value that drives your profitability. Cost of production gives us an idea of what you need to produce to cover your expenses, your accrual expenses. But we can affect that number in a couple of different ways. As you look at this production level, you can see that the 25% of the herds were near 100 pounds of energy corrected milk this last year. So as you look at where we're at, we've got a pretty sizable range here as we look at that. Within this group, the upper end was not necessarily the profit end. It was across the board, and it really came down to does your production match your expense system? And so, as you've said many times here, milk production is not the only answer. It's helping to manage that. And I think that along with that milk production and from the profitability standpoint is we start looking at this mailbox price. We had herds that a number of herds that were in excess of $20 a hundredweight for milk last year. That was with the crash that occurred in April and May. And how are they getting there? Well, that's as you look at the group, the difference in basis, and we can do some things about our basis, and we can't do some things. But as you look at the difference between the top 25% and the average, it's an additional 50 cents a hundredweight after we take the trucking out of the mix. Both groups saw a fairly substantial drop from where they were in 2019. I mean, nobody was sheltered from that mix, but you can see that the difference between the two grew, where we had about a 30-cent difference, a 25-cent difference in 2019. That grew to a 40-cent difference in 2020, and so it does have a huge impact. And as you look at overall components for these herds, very similar components between the two groups. But it is an area where you do have some opportunity to drive your milk income is by producing some high component, high quality milk, maximizing the price your processor is giving you to its fullest benefit is the part that you can control. You can't always control what they are giving you for a price, but you can control whether you're maximizing that value or not.
It certainly was no fun to see the negative $8, $4, $5, but we still saw the gross milk check be $19.44 for an average. And I guess going into the year and after the pandemic we had gone through, I mean, if somebody had told you you'd end up $19.44, I think we would have taken that. Now we got there, and it's a little different route how we got there, and it didn't make a whole lot of sense sometimes, but still $19.44 is still not a bad year. So we saw 2020 be a very profitable year overall for a lot of dairy farmers. It just was a weird way of getting there. And then that income pre-tax dollar per cow, just look at the wide range again of it's kind of the first slide we showed too earlier. Again, not sure if we can take a whole lot out of this from 2020 to go into 2021, but just something to show the wide range. Again, you see that top 25%, how they kind of separate themselves from everybody else. It's just all the little things that added to that net income. So, some of that was government programs, and again, your structure did have a structure had a part to play with that, or whether you got some programs at all. There are some operations out there that don't participate in any government program, so there's some operations that didn't get any money for CFAP 1 or CFAP 2. So, but just understanding what caused that is more interesting than anything else, and just going forward, we'll you run some budgets, we can work off of that as well.
I think that is the thing that we want to leave everybody with is that, you know, you have to understand your business well enough that you're making independent choices. It's great to be able to look at how you compare to others, but you really need to make independent choices on expense reduction, how you know, where your next growth opportunity from a revenue standpoint is, and you know, how you can drive your future, because there isn't one answer for out there to make it happen. It's different for every dairy, how they are in their business life cycle and their family life cycle. And so it's great to be able to look at this information and see how you fit, how you compare. But we truly do need to make sure that we're making choices not based on what the neighbor is doing, but on what's best for your operation. And part of that is having a good set of advisors to work with. So
by using these numbers, if we can have some critical conversations, you know, that we may not like how the numbers look, but if we can have a conversation as to why they are that way, and then also make some offsetting strengths in some other areas. It's all about those critical conversations we have with our dairy team, our financial advisors, to try to make some management decisions and management changes that, again, we're trying to get from better to best. Where can we get another 25, 50 cents of margin there? Sometimes just all about the little things. It might be 10 different items where we gain a nickel, but there again, those conversations are probably more important to have than anything else.
Nicole, we'll toss it back to you if there's any questions.
All right, thanks you guys. Tons of great information there. I will tell the audience that now is your time for questions. So if you have them, please type them in the question box. I'll be monitoring that. We do have one to start with, you guys, and I know this kind of goes back to the point you just made about every dairy is unique and has to make their own decisions. But based on consulting experiences, do most herds still have opportunities to cut costs, or should more of them be looking at maximizing their income or increasing profits?
Well, I think in every operation, it's a little bit of both. I mean, every operation that I've worked with has some strengths and some weaknesses. So if we can turn those weaknesses into strengths, definitely, whether it be in cost of production, there's always room for lowering costs. Now, that may not mean always lowering the total cost we have, but it might, when we look at total cost per hundredweight, it might mean where do we maximize some production. So it's a combination of both. I don't say there's one way that's right or one way that's wrong, but again, it's probably a little bit on both. I know definitely we have an opportunity to increase some income out there. And again, it's just not major things. We're not talking about items that are going to increase your income by $2 a hundredweight, or items that are going to decrease your expense by $2 a hundredweight. It's just all those little things. But yeah, every operation has some opportunities on both ends, I believe.
I would say that anybody that is listening to today's webinar and that I'm working with, they're probably screaming at their screens that I'm never satisfied. So once they finally, you know, we make headway in a specific area, I'm always asking, okay, what's the next step? What's the next area that we can work on? So in answer to that question, the operations that Steve and I are working with, there's not big, huge chunks of differences that they can make. It's tweaking a line item expense. It's gaining an additional half a pound of milk, or leveling out their production throughout the year, leveling out their components throughout the year. I think that's probably one area that they all are striving for is to try and take some of the peaks and valleys out of their expenses, out of their cow flows, out of their production, and try to have a little flatter. That's where a number of them, their next gains are coming from. It's just filling in the valleys.
You still need to spend, you still need to spend money to make money. So, but now where can you control, where can you maximize it? That's the trick. It's try to find that sweet spot.
Great. Great answer to that question. I do have a few more questions that are coming in. Next question is, what advice do you have to prepare for unprecedented years in the future?
Well, a lot of what we talk about as lending institution is working capital. I mean, working capital is kind of the lifeline of an operation. Where can we set some money aside, pay down lines of credit, put cash, get some cash reserves, just in case we have this unprecedented situation again. So working capital is very important in a lot of operations. Now, of course, it takes cash to do that, but like last year, you find out real quick where the money was used. Was it used wisely or was it used unwisely? So what we had last year we had a great opportunity to improve our working capital position. A lot of people did. They paid down account payables, paid down lines of credit, prepaid some items, built cash reserves. So I mean, I think a lot of them are prepared for already, but I can never stress enough that working capital is very important going forward to kind of take care of those unforeseen situations.
That by far is the number one thing. I think the other thing that I circle back with, and you brought it up a number of times, Steve, is that planning part of the equation, especially on the capital side. If we have a capital plan that we're executing on year over year and something does come up that really shorts us from a performance standpoint, we can pick and choose a few items not to do this on this year's plan and push them into the next year and not really upset our apple cart and not really hinder our business. I think that's one of the things you look at that top group. They do execute on that, and so when we get into good times, they're not having to catch up on replacing various items. They've been replacing at a steady rate, and so they're able to put all of that value to working capital. And so I can't say enough about the value of planning, both from a capital standpoint, but also from an overall budgeting standpoint. And I think that also is where the accrual side of the equation comes in. You're going to be able to see challenges to your operation far faster by evaluating things on an accrual basis than just on your checkbook balance. If you're waiting until your checkbook runs out of money, oftentimes you're well down the road into challenges before that shows up. So all of those pieces working together, I think, really help prepare folks for those challenges that do come along.
Such great points to be prepared, you guys. A few more questions here. So next I'm going to jump into, what is your recommendation for locking in purchased feed costs?
Tim, I'll defer to you on that one there. You should have.
That's really easily said. I mean, I understand there's all sorts of challenges that have gone along with that. It's something that a number of dairies feel they've missed the boat on. I'll challenge them that we still need to have that critical conversation where they're at, because I don't think this is a 6-month ordeal. So I think we need to be consistently looking at our purchase feed, looking at opportunities when we do get some down market, maybe to lock in a little farther out than what we currently are if we aren't. I also think that taking advantage of some of these down markets right now will allow us to maybe book some things higher than where we were back in November and December, but still lower than the peak that we were just at. And depending on who you're talking to, we could be looking at another peak coming at us, depending on how weather affects this crop and how exports go on these crops. So it's definitely not done, finished. We need to keep evaluating it on an ongoing basis.
And a lot depends on how current feed costs affect your budget. So if you run a budget, and now we can update the budget based on the current feed costs. If we're still at a margin, hey, maybe it's not a bad idea to lock some feed costs in for the future, even though they're a little higher. I know Tim and myself run a farm call just last week, and the farmer was mentioning that he was feeding a certain amount of ration to his, I think, just fresh animals, but the costs were like $800 a ton for that feed. And he thought that was too high, but he did see some performance out of the animals. But when you really break it down, it only because of the ration he was using, it only ended up being like 22 cents a cow per day cost. So sometimes you look at what the actual costs are per cow. But again, if you have a good budget put in place and the budget can be changed, so plug in those higher feed costs right now, if it still gives you a margin, heck, there's nothing wrong locking some of the prices in, even though they're at higher levels right now. They can go either way. And that's maybe why you don't want to lock all of it in. But again, just knowing your numbers and knowing what today's feed costs, how they affect your operation, if you can guarantee a profit, you can never go wrong. And maybe some of those prices they guarantee some profit even.
And that's the thing that I think we kind of fell into a little bit of contentment because feed prices were so flat for so long. We quit looking at that income over feed cost margin and what that margin was for the milk. And we really need to get back to that discipline of looking at the margin, because cutting feed costs, if we lose milk production, cuts margin. So we need to make sure we're evaluating those feed costs on the amount of margin that they provide. If we cut feed and lose milk, oftentimes we're cutting our nose off to spite our face. So making sure we're evaluating all of the pieces.
Okay. Very good. Another question here. If you had to pick one or two areas to reduce costs without decreasing milk production and overall profitability, what would those one or two areas be? No pressure.
Well, if I was to pick two, it would be feed costs and labor costs, or number one and number two expenses on the sheet. The reality of it is that we should have very little room left to cut on those, you know. And so, as Steve has mentioned, I don't know that there's a single line item that looks at it. I think that it's 5 cents here, it's 5 cents there, it's a couple cents there. If I was to look at one item though that probably has still some impact, we have a number of operations that are working on it and moving well forward, is that net herd replacement cost. Making sure that we have our heifer inventory balanced to our replacement needs so that we don't have additional costs of growing that animal that we may not need. Making sure that we aren't pushing cows out the door because we have an excessive number of heifers that are coming in, and making that culling decision at the right time when she's dried off, when she's nice and fleshy, versus keeping her through that whole dry period, the expense of a pre-fresh ration, the expense of a post-fresh ration, and then have her leave in the first 60 days of lactation. And because she's down to skin and bones, we get $150 for her. So if there is one, there probably is still some room for a number of herds to work on. That probably is an opportunity for a lot of different dairy operations.
And I'm going to take on a lender perspective, a little different approach here. Interest rates have been low, so I mean, a lot of people have locked in, some have not. But if we can look at our overall principal and interest, look how your debt is structured. Take a look at your loans. Where can we consolidate some loans, stretch payments out a little longer, still making principal interest payments, but maybe stretched out to a 7-year term versus a 5-year term. Look at some of those dealer contracts that were just put in place. They might be good interest rates, but they might be termed over a 2 and 3 year period of time. Where can we consolidate some of that stuff, put them on one main capital loan and have lower payments? You know, payments are part of cost of production as well, principal and interest. So whatever we can do to cut costs there, that improves cash flow, improves working capital. So take a look at your total balance sheet, look at how your debt is structured, make sure you're not paying too heavy on some debt. We still want to make sure we're paying enough principal off to maintain and keep ahead of management depreciation. If we haven't already locked in some rates, let's lock some rates in. Rates, we've seen them pretty low, so we can get some pretty good long-term rates locked in. So maybe the locking in the rate isn't going to help your interest expense today because maybe on a short-term rate, but we're looking at long-term future. If we can go on a 15 and 20-year fixed rate at a slightly higher rate than we're paying on a 1, 2, 3 year rate, let's look at those things for long-term security as well too. But yeah, how our debt is structured also is a cost. It's cash coming out of our pockets, and if we can structure that properly, we can lower our production costs, cost of production as well.
Good. All right. 2 more questions that I have here. Not as well, kind of not as specific, a little different. But from your financial standpoint, what technologies do you see are on the forefront that will really change our industry moving forward?
Well, we're seeing it right now, and a lot of these renewable natural gas companies are talking to a lot of our producers. How can we look at how can we gain more income without milking more cows? That's a great example. It's a great concept that's in place right now. There's some details that be worked on that, but that's one of the technologies I see going forward of how do you provide some more income without really creating a whole lot more cost structure or capital investment as well too. So I think that's on the forefront right now. The renewable natural gas is one of the technologies I see is that could be a big player.
That's a huge revenue opportunity. On the expense side of the equation, we're going to continue to see the robotic world creep into our dairy operation, whether it's robotic milking or robotic dipping or we're just on the real front end of what robotics could be for our dairy operations. So there's that. I think that we're getting more and more herds that are using a herd monitoring system and trying to take a little bit out of their animal health costs by getting on top of challenged cows a little bit quicker, helping them on their breeding programs. So we're seeing a number of herds that are implementing programs associated with that and seeing some real successes from a performance standpoint, from a cow standpoint. And I think the other one that it kind of goes hand in hand with what Steve was talking about with the renewable natural gas is on the manure management technologies. We're going to continue to see opportunities to fractionate manure, to take nutrients out, manage those nutrients more appropriately. But currently, they're just at a level that are just not quite in place for a lot of operations. I think we're going to continue to see progress on those systems being more viable on more and more operations.
A water purification system out there is going to limit the volume, so that's going to have a major player. There's some costs involved there right now, but I think that over time those costs will come down to be more sustainable, that an operation can function and utilize those technologies.
Great, that's exciting. I mean, exciting stuff as we move forward, and you know, to see the improvements, you know, that the technologies bring is always really great. Now, this last question's a little bit longer, so brace yourselves. I'll try to make it as succinct as possible. But DBA and Edge, our sister organization, Edge Dairy Farmer Cooperative, have been very involved in conservation efforts related to water quality. What this person is asking is wondering if you guys on the financial side of things are seeing any anecdotal correlation with those savings along the lines of like fuel or tillage costs and profitability at this point, or is it just too early yet to generalize profitability through conservation, and is it just based, you know, on a farm by farm basis?
Well, I'm not sure we're seeing specifically, but we know darn well if we're going to save on fuel, we save on cost, and as long as we can do those practices and not, you know, have a yield drag or again, not that it doesn't create that margin. So yeah, definitely if we can cut costs with conservation, we're definitely seeing it affecting bottom lines. I think with the technology and a lot of the seeds we have, we're seeing tremendous yields come from very low minimum tillage and using that technology to create some nice margins there on the cropping end. So yeah, I'm not saying specifically I can say that these practices are creating that much more income, but I think common sense tells us that we know that it definitely is affecting that bottom line.
In the data set that we've got, we don't have enough definition to be able to parse out those individual techniques and opportunities, but I agree with Steve that on a farm by farm partial budgeting basis that we've been able to work with some of these farms as they look at implementing those technologies, where we are able to show those individual operations the value that it does provide. But right now the scope and variability amongst all of those different things is enough that we really don't have enough good solid data to really drive it to a specific change in their value in their cost production.
In a lot of operations, we track their cost of fuel, but we also track the gallons of fuel used. So in a lot of operations, you can see, well, they're running the same amount of acres they did last year. We can track, and it does show that they're using less fuel. So again, common sense tells us the less fuel that's used over the same amount of acres is definitely going to lower their cost and improve their bottom line. So we definitely do track those things. But again, it's like Tim said, we don't actually specifically pull them out, but we know they're there and they are making a difference.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to watch as more farms implement, you know, different practices to really start to get enough data to analyze that, you know, and our big thing is, you know, move forward with the conservation efforts, you know, that our farmers do so well at, but we just have to make sure it makes financial sense for their bottom lines as well. So, you know, definitely watching that on all fronts is interesting. So, well, that's it, you guys, for questions. You both have been great. Like I said, tons of fabulous information. I do want to just take an opportunity and once again thank Compeer Financial. You're such a tremendous supporter of DBA and all that we do, and great example here today of the expertise that you bring to our association and to all of the farms that you guys work with. I do want to just take a quick second. Don't forget, we have our DBA Dairy Golf Classic coming up on Tuesday, June 15th. So registrations have been pouring in. We're looking forward to a great event in Mishicot, Wisconsin for that. And then we always have our Dairy Stream podcast coming out as well. So make sure you tune into those episodes as they come out. Always some really good content on Dairy Stream. So with that, once again, Tim, Steve, thank you so much. And anyone has any ideas for other topics that they want to hear about, don't hesitate to reach out to us at info@dairyforward.com. So thanks again, guys. Hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you.